Good evening, my beloved Beatle people. My name is Jordan Runtagh. I'm a host and producer at iHeartRadio and a writer for People magazine. And tonight I have the unenviable task of following the Fab Four. To help me out, we have a group of very special guests. I'm thrilled to share the stage with them. Please welcome television executive, producer, author, and day one U.S. Beatles fan, Debbie Gendler Supnick. Journalist, professor, host of the Everything Fab Four podcast, and author of some of my very favorite books about the Beatles, Mr. Kenneth Womack. Author, filmmaker, narrator, and one of my very favorite parts of this film, Jamie Bernstein. The senior culture correspondent at CBS News, Mr. Anthony Mason. And the director of the wonderful film you just saw, Mr. David Tedeschi. Yay! Thank you so much for joining us tonight. First of all, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
There's been so much said about the Beatles. I can imagine that it has to be daunting to set out to make a documentary about them in 2024. What did you want to say with this? What's something new that you wanted fans to take away?
Well, I think the film speaks for itself, but I will say it was a great challenge at the very beginning because, it's a very famous story. It's been told many times before, and even 8 Days a Week, which is a wonderful film, you think, well, we've had live performance films. How can this be different? And something that appeared to be a real challenge at first turned out to be a great blessing, which was, it's just 2 weeks. It's just 2 weeks in time, and it allowed us to be very specific.
And when I first heard about this project, I was wondering if it was going to be almost like Get Back 64, where it was just going to be the Maysles brothers footage. And that could have been one way to do it. And you went a different route where you had a whole lot of contemporary interviews that provided amazing context. I was wondering, how did you decide to go that route versus the other?
This was the initial concept of the film.
Oh, really?
I thought it'd be interesting. I didn't think that the Maysles, I knew that the Maysles had shot 11 hours worth of footage, and which is, in this world of this style of filmmaking, it's not very much footage. And they shot a lot in New York, but they shot very little in Washington and very little in Miami. So I thought that we would have to do something else. But we go through, editing for us is a process of discovery. And it was very quick turnaround. It was a year the edit room was open, which sounds like a long time, but we've taken much longer on other projects. And we tried a version that had none of the interviews, and it didn't play as well, in my opinion. The interviews, it's not just context, they add a level of emotion to what you're saying.
Now, can you talk more about where this footage came from? It was shot by, the legendary filmmakers Albert and David Maysles, and a lot of it has never been seen before. I mean, where was this footage? What was the process like of cleaning it up and restoring it, both visually and sonically?
Apple Corps, the Beatles company, got from the Maysles brothers all the footage, but it came in boxes, and it wasn't particularly well organized at that point. It had vinegar syndrome, and they didn't really know what to do with it. And after Get Back, Peter Jackson, was talking to one of the producers. He's like, "What else you got?" And he's like, "Well, we don't know what to do with this. We have these boxes of." He said, "Well, we'll take it." That Kiwi's like a challenge. And he has an amazing company that does film restoration called Park Road. And it's not just that they restored it lovingly, they put it into a chronology. And it had very damaged work print, it had negative, it had all sorts of different sources. And then we also, so there's news, a lot of news footage in there, and collectors, Super 8 footage, different archives. And they were almost everything, they restored everything. Almost everything looks pristine. I mean, particularly that George in the press conference when he says, you know, what's your ambition? To go to America. That was a inner negative of a print of an inner negative of a inner negative of a positive of a, like it looked so bad. And what we had was on Super 8. And somehow they were able to make the blacks rich and the grain match everything else. It's like, to me, it's like a miracle.
I mean, obviously everybody on this stage cares so deeply about the Beatles. I was wondering, just opening up to everybody, was there a moment in this documentary that changed how you saw them, how you felt about them? Was there something that really surprised you?
Well, I can jump right in and say that the big surprise for me was how fantastic the performance of Long Tall Sally was. Yeah. Like, they were a band who could perform, and you know, that's what we lost as time went by and they stopped touring and they stopped performing in public and became recording artists. And so it's very precious to have that footage where you can actually see, and I was told that it was the last number in the concert in Washington, right? Yeah. So you can tell that they were just going for broke at the end, and Ringo's just driving that train, and it was a total thrill for me to see them in that animus, because it's a thing that was lost.
To Jamie's point, I would say I've interviewed Paul a couple of times when he's talked about how he couldn't hear in Shea Stadium and all of those concerts, or the early concerts. And so I always assumed if you actually heard the audio, they wouldn't sound very good. And they sound amazing. And the Washington Coliseum is an abysmal place to perform. I mean, it was a boxing arena at that point. It had been an ice rink before. It has a concrete vaulted ceiling. It's like a big version of the Cavern Club, you know? And I mean, if you think about it. And the acoustics were prehistoric. And yet you were able, I mean, you can do all the audio sweetening you want. If the original performance isn't good, it's not gonna matter. And that performance was extraordinary. Yeah. And it tells you were looking at an extraordinary four-piece band. So whatever happened in this country at that moment, that was a great band.
Yeah.
Well, I'm on the stage now with two people who saw the Beatles perform live. I mean, can you both, Debbie and Jamie, share me your experiences of what it was actually like to be in a very large arena seeing them?
Obviously, my very favorite concert, I saw them perform 6 times as a band in different concerts, from Forest Hills to Shea Stadium to Suffolk Down to Atlantic City. And my very favorite, though, concert was at Forest Hills that summer of 1964. There was something about that was very intimate and unbelievably exciting. Truly, we could not hear anything, nothing at all.
Not a single note.
Not a single note, no. And the pandemonium actually began before the concert started, because this fellow showed up and he was a Paul McCartney lookalike. And the whole place went crazy. So much so that I found years later an article written by Nora Ephron. She was a Cub reporter at the time, and she covered the Forest Hills Stadium concert, and she wrote about this fellow who showed up. And that's when it started, and then it never calmed down after that. So, yeah, that was my favorite, but of course, you know, Shea Stadium, and we're gonna be coming up to its 60th anniversary in August next year. Amazing experience, and you know, I remember marveling just being there, and you know, so many other, you know, 55,000 other people there at that concert. It was just unbelievable, and
but you couldn't hear a thing.
You couldn't hear a thing. You couldn't hear a thing.
Nothing.
No.
And did that bother you?
No,
Oh, it really bothered me.
you had a good
I wanted
musical
to hear
family. As we just screamed.
And we were, way up in the bleachers, and they were these little ants down
Yeah.
there in the middle of the
Little
ball field.
ants.
And you couldn't hear anything except, these 747 engines. That's what it sounded like, the screams that never stopped.
Right.
So it was kind of disappointing. I mean,
Oh,
big,
no,
big
I
points
agree,
for getting to
right?
be there and everything. But
I have one memory of Shea Stadium really distinct, and that is when John takes his elbow and starts playing the keyboards back and forth. I
Jerry
so
Lee Lewis.
remember that.
Yeah.
That moment. Otherwise, the whole thing, is over in 29 minutes or something like that. That's how long the concert was.
yeah,
So
it took
it
a
was
lot longer
over.
to get there and get out.
That's for sure.
I mean, most of the new footage that I've seen from the Maisels was of the fans, and it really blew me away that they took the time to talk to these people and to not only show them respect, but reverence for the amount of emotion that they were giving. I mean, I feel like the Maisels showed them a lot more respect than a lot of the other adults that were sort of in their midst. I mean, there were some truly disturbing clips of some adults, like that one guy who
Yes.
was pretending to be the manager, throwing the full weight of his adulthood into talking down to these girls that are, a fraction of his age. It was really distressing. And to see the Maisels speak very, respectfully to them.
Don't you think that says a lot about them carrying out reportage, right? Making sure we're seeing all the story, maybe even the parts we don't like. They were great at that.
Yeah.
And of course, not just in this footage, but in their other masterworks too. And Beatlemania, while wonderful, as we all know, also has a dark side, right? This energy does go to a dark place, and you start to see it seeping in occasionally.
That's true.
Can you speak more to what exactly it was that the Beatles riled up in these people? I mean, I know you had the clip of Betty Friedan talking about they represented the new man, and I imagine that made the old men, literally and metaphorically speaking, feel left behind. I mean, can you talk more culturally about sort of what the Beatles brought out of people who were very anti?
I could add something to that. After I met the Beatles in 1965, and there was a newspaper article about me with a picture of what I got and autographs and things. And a couple days later, I go to my mailbox, and I actually received hate mail. Now, sending a 15-year-old girl hate mail, and it was over the picture of me in the paper, and it wrote, "You're nuts. What's wrong with our American guys? They're going to the banks laughing at you." So this was in 1965, that there was actually a contingent of people who still did not understand what was happening in our culture, our music, and what was going on with a whole, part of our, society at the time. I mean, to send a 15-year-old hate mail is unbelievable. Yes.
But it is true that that moment when the Beatles first came to the United States was, in fact, the moment when everything was starting to change in the culture. And it's so wonderful what John Lennon says at the end about being in the crow's nest. Land ho, that he was perceiving, or they were all perceiving, that this new land was coming into view. And so it turned out that all us Beatlemaniacs were sort of, on this amazing shot of the giant wave.
Yeah.
I love that wave. We were the wave. We were the wave. And it happened gradually as we were living through it, but looking back on it, of course, as usual, it all seemed to go a lot faster. And just think, this was 1964, and 4 years later, only 4 years later, we were having, or 3 years later, was the Summer of Love and everything that was happening in Haight-Ashbury and hippies, and everything was suddenly, in bold print how the whole culture was changing. And the Beatles kind of, they were the welcome mat, kind of. Mat, that's not a very nice thing to say. They were not a mat.
The biggest surprise for me was the degree to which there was an establishment that was against the Beatles and that worked against them. They wanted them to fail. I mean, part of it is generational. That voiceover at the beginning is Eric Severide giving his report, comparing the Beatlemania to the German measles.
Yes.
And
So condescending.
on the one hand, on the other hand, he was a war correspondent.
Yeah.
And I don't think, at least in his case, I don't think he really understood what was going on. And the Newsweek review that John reads, or even Capitol Records itself, it waited a year before they released the music because they really didn't think it could be successful.
Yeah.
I'd known that vaguely, but when you see it in the British Embassy, when you see it in context, it's very surprising.
Well, all the early press. I mean, I remember pulling from the CBS archive I think it was the first television story done in America about the Beatles. It was done from London.
Yeah.
Oh, the Cronkite one?
Yeah, it was
yeah.
it was incredibly dismissive and condescending, and it was all oh, here's another music fad. It'll be over, before you blink, and and so I don't think anybody understood what was happening, and partly I think a big part of it is I don't think the Beatles even understood what was happening.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty clear in the film.
Yeah.
And it was this weird collision between a culture that was ready to turn and a group that made it turn. Because I know when I was approaching 8 years old at the time, and my mother had just gotten remarried. We moved here to 49th Street. So when I walked to Central Park, I walked by the front of the Plaza Hotel 2 weeks later, and there are all these kids out front. And I looked at my babysitter and I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "The Beatles are there." And I already had my Beatles wig, so I was really. And unlike Danny Burnett, I didn't keep it in the bag. I wore it. And, but what it felt like to me, and admittedly I'm 8, but I think retrospectively I looked at it, and it felt like there was at that point in America there was still kind of an overhang from the 50s.
Totally.
There was still sort of an oppressiveness in our culture, and it's like you look at that news conference at Kennedy Airport, they just batted away all of the obnoxious questions. It was like, pew, pew. It's fascinating to watch in its entirety. And it's like they blew open the doors to the 60s in those first few days. And we kind of never looked back.
After a transatlantic flight, too, a long overnight flight. I always think of that, seeing those one-liners.
Exactly.
It's like, he's doing that without sleep. Wow.
Yeah.
It was a masterstroke, David, to include that footage as you did from the British Embassy, right? Yeah. Because it draws a defining line with what you've just been talking about, right? The establishment versus this new wave. I know you love the wave, right? But it's very significant because there they are with their betters who, literally Ringo has a lock of hair cut away and they're made to feel diminished in this incredible moment of triumph. And it gives the film a certain sense of gravitas, right? Because they then have to spend the rest of the 2 weeks sort of getting over that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't the only example of that. There were even the Muhammad Ali photo, was not fun for them, And John, that interview of John talking about the British Embassy, he's very clear, some animal came up to Ringo and cut out, It's interesting. On the one hand, on the other hand, we did want to include people like Leonard Bernstein who liked the Beatles. It's not like every older person or every member of the establishment was against the Beatles, but there was some kind of divide.
But it took Leonard Bernstein. Was it on Omnibus, Jamie, that he came out and basically endorsed the Beatles?
No, it was actually a special show that he did about rock and roll. Inside Pop, is that what it was called?
Inside the Rock Revolution, the
Something-
David
yeah,
Oppenheim,
that's right,
David
yeah.
Oppenheim, right? Yeah.
And he basically had to take people through. It's okay.
It won't hurt you.
It won't hurt you.
But it's also in the young people's concerts. He uses Beatles songs in the young, so it's earlier. It's pretty early.
He sang And I Love Her to demonstrate the ABA form of sonata form.
Yeah.
And of course, the kids in the audience and all those reaction shots they're priceless. The minute he played a Beatles song, he knew he would have their attention focused right on him and whatever he was telling them about. So he did it a lot. He he would use pop music all the time. And that gave this unspoken message to the entire country on broadcast television that, you know, the conductor of the New York Philharmonic was giving his stamp of approval to the Beatles and all pop music. That was kind of a big deal in those days.
Yeah.
Huge deal.
Did he discuss that with you at home? Did he kind of break down some of the things they were doing musically?
Oh, he never stopped. He was the teacher fire hose. And he figured out very quickly that by, you know, whenever we listened to pop music on the radio, he would use it as the springboard to talk about whatever he wanted to tell us about music. So, you know, You Really Got Me came on the radio. Remember You Really Got Me? Of course. Da-da-da-da-da.
Did you about like the
You
fifth
really got me
Yes.
going.
Right.
So we're listening to it on the radio, and he goes, hey, you know, this song is in the Mixolydian mode. Do you know what a mode is? No, we didn't know what a mode was, but so he explained the whole thing. And the next Young People's Concert topic, what do you suppose it was? Modes. And when he got to the Mixolydian mode, what did he do? He went to the piano, and he played and sang You Really Got Me.
Wow.
And it was awesome.
I mean, I always feel so grateful talking to day one Beatles fans because, you know, I first came to them and their story had been written, you know? I mean, they were already enshrined as this modern myth, this like almost biblical epic. And plus, and their canon was all there. So you had all these multiple access points depending on which music genre spoke to you. And to experience it with no context, with no cultural baggage, and to come to it, I'm just so curious, what was it about them? Anyone on the stage who's lived through it, what about them connected with you first? Was it musically? Was it the camaraderie? Was it how they looked? Was it the friendship that they obviously shared? I mean, what was it?
Okay. Well, I'm happy to answer that question because it's pretty simple. When I first saw them, it was 1963. I got an album from England as a gift, and I saw their faces, and I said, wow, I love these guys. Okay? I hadn't heard a single note.
Why? Just because they were
loved
cute,
them
or just
from their look? Okay. I mean, I still look at that Please Please Me album every once in a while, and I think, wow, their hair's so short, and they look a little, you know, gawky in it. And so, oh no, but it just, you know, floored me because we were coming out of the era of all the Bobbies, of the Bobby Rydell and the Bobby Van and the, you know, Bobby Darin, and nothing against them. I mean, today I look back, I love Bobby Darin's music. However, back then I was thinking, no, I started to play the album and I tried to get kids from my high school to love them, but they hadn't broken through just yet. And so you had to really be of a certain ilk that wanted to do something and felt, you know, you felt secure in your individualism, in your music taste to love them. But boy, you know, after Ed Sullivan Show, I went from being ridiculed to like the most popular kid in town. You know, the first day back after the Sullivan Show, I got called to see the vice principal. Now, the vice principal was the school disciplinarian, right? And I thought, oh no, I'm in trouble. And he then said to me, please, the next day, bring your English Beatles album. I heard that you had it. So I think that, you know, for a lot of girls like me, at first, it wasn't the music per se. It was the overall look, the cuteness. And we watched those newsreels at home when they arrived on CBS News and all of that, and how they answered. We thought, right, Jimmy? We thought, wow, how great are they? How cute? How this? And then the music came, and it was just spectacular. I want to hold your hand. She loves you. Oh, wow, you know. Anyway, I could go on and on.
I remember the night I first heard I Want to Hold Your Hand on my little clock radio above my bed. And there I was listening to it in the dark. And I remember that my reaction was that this music sounds so intellectual. And I imagined that they all wore glasses and looked like Buddy Holly. Before I knew what they looked like. You know, it all sounded so clever and kind of, high level.
But the
Isn't that
thing about
funny?
it was incredibly sophisticated, but it was incredibly accessible. That was one of the, and I remember when my kids were growing up and playing the same music for them and watching how they reacted. And they reacted the same way I reacted. And it's, 30 years later or whatever it was. And I think that was, I was literally, I took my Beatles wig, I grabbed a tennis racket. My friend Sandy Kenyon, who was the entertainment reporter at Channel 7 for years, we were in school together. He had a Beatles wig and a tennis racket. We took the stereo out onto the balcony, put the record on, and played it for anybody we thought could hear. And I remember when I got my car when I was living in the burbs, and I was listening to XM radio when it started, and they would play the 60s channel would play the top charts. Every day they'd have a new one. And I listened to it for weeks, partly because I was trying to figure out when I came to consciousness as a kid. But the thing you really notice from 1963 to 1964 is how much music changes. And it changes because of what the Beatles did. And all those bobbies you talked about got blown off the radio, just blown off the radio. They couldn't get on again because the sound changed. And their sound was incredibly fresh and bright and accessible. But also, the more you listened to it, the more you realized was there. And that was the genius of the Beatles, because as time went on, you didn't age out of it. You learned to appreciate it even more.
And every new generation that comes along falls in love with them too.
Yeah.
And it's the damnedest thing, the way they never subside, they never go out of style, they never seem old-fashioned, particularly, even though it was quite a while ago.
I was born in 1987, and I cut out a cardboard Hofner bass when I was a kid too, and did the same thing you did with the tennis racket. And I, for multiple reasons, I ask myself, why?
Yeah.
And I know, in the documentary, you posit a number of theories. One of which being, it was so soon after the assassination of JFK, and America wanted a reason to celebrate. I didn't have those restrictions on my life growing up in the early 90s, and I don't know why it touches me in that way. And that's one of the great mysteries of the Beatles, one of the great mysteries of music. It's something that I find so interesting. If anyone has any insight onto why the Beatles...
You know what makes this so special and why we come back to this story over and over? Because it's a great story, right?
Yeah.
And David has told it so very, very well. And what makes it so special is these guys come over. We make a big fuss about them, a hullabaloo like nobody's ever seen, right? These guys right here are living testimony.
Yes.
We make this massive fuss over them, and they make good on it.
Yeah.
The next several years, they don't sit idly by, right? We get Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, The White Album, Abbey Road. Nobody does that. That's why we celebrate them, and that's why this footage is so precious. Because it's not the end, it's just the beginning.
Yeah, that's right. And it's true what you say. It began as a sort of, it looked like it was just going to be, the fad of the moment, the little temporary phenomenon. And then, as you say, it turned out they were fabulous musicians, which nobody really anticipated. It wasn't part of the original
Leonard Bernstein.
Leonard
got
Bernstein and Sam Cooke. It's not in the movie,
right.
but we had an interview.
Yeah.
There's a radio interview with Sam Cooke where they asked, this is just a flash in the pan. And he's like, no,
Yeah.
these guys are going to be around for a while.
Yeah. And it wasn't a fad, it was a cultural earthquake.
Yeah.
And it was the second, if you look at Elvis as kind of the first one in '56, which I wasn't around for, but it was the second one. And the thing that, the aftershock of that was all the bands that were essentially created in the moment of the Ed Sullivan performance.
Yeah.
Because the list of musicians who will tell you on that day, at that minute, is when I wanted to be in a band,
Right.
is endless. Literally, many of your favorite artists essentially were born in that moment. Tom Petty, Billy Joel, David Crosby, it goes on and on and on. And that was the aftershock of the Beatles. And it's really, I've always felt, was their real legacy. Their music is obviously their first legacy, but it's that they gave birth to all of these other bands who wanted to be them, and they wanted to be songwriters all of a sudden, and they wanted to be in a band.
For me, one of the most special clips in the film, it's the only footage that I'm aware of somebody, a family, watching this oft-recalled moment
Gonzalez.
in real time.
Yeah.
And the first time I ever saw that, I couldn't believe it existed. And so can you talk a little about how that footage came to be, first of all?
You know, it is the genius of the Maisel brothers. You know, it was, as I understand it, was an improvised moment. They figured they could sneak into the CBS theater where Sullivan was being filmed. And of course, the security would not let them in with the cameras. And they decided to go to a tenement, which they missed the first two songs. They decided to go to a tenement around the corner, as close as they, could get to the Sullivan Theater. And they listened at the doors to see if they could hear anyone listening to Sullivan, watching Sullivan. And the first they heard, they knocked on the door. Hey, can we film you? And of course, they captured this amazing, that's a classic moment of direct cinema. It's
That's
a different
amazing.
way of looking at a story, and it's very emotionally powerful.
Very much so. I mean, you see these two girls' faces, and I love the look of anxiety on the dad's face on the plastic-covered couch that I've seen in my family. I mean, and that was a really special moment to capture.
And of course, you see the whole world changes after that moment. You get the next act, Dan Sullivan, and it's so ridiculous.
The plate spinners or whatever.
And she is so disappointed.
Right.
It's amazing.
Were you able to get in touch with the Gonzalez family?
No, we traced them. They're alive. The two girls are alive, but they live in Puerto Rico. But we didn't want to contact people until we were sure we wanted to talk to them, and we weren't. The scene speaks for itself. It's very powerful, and I would say this is another aspect of what the Maisels did. Like, the Beatles are performers and they're very charismatic, and it's not surprising that they come off so beautifully in the film. But the girls on the street, the fans, and the Gonzalez, they're not performers necessarily. And yet the energy of the Maisels is able to bring out the energy of who they're shooting. It's a mystery to me how they did it. And I watched Al work quite a lot. He worked with us on Shine a Light. And seeing it in person, it was a mystery how he could just get people to shine onto the camera.
Just being completely unobtrusive, too.
Yeah.
I mean, some of those moments that they were able to capture. I mean, I can't believe, in today's PR-savvy world, there's no way that they would have gotten 90% of the thing. The after party at the Peppermint Lounge, like, never been allowed in there. It's really incredible. Anthony, you were speaking earlier about how the Sullivan performance was the big bang for, a whole generation or several of musicians to follow. And a lot of documentaries over the last 30, 40 years or so, they have that moment where they talk to XYZ rock royalty, and they tell that very similar story about, I saw a band on Sullivan. Next day I got my friends, we were in the garage. And I was really fascinated that you took a different approach, I feel like, for this documentary, where you spoke to people who were impacted by the Beatles' music in less obvious ways. And I felt that as a fan, that resonated more deeply with me, because we don't all hear the Beatles' music and go form a band. Even fewer of us go hear the Beatles' music and form a successful band. But I feel like all of us at one time or another turn to the Beatles' music in moments of celebration or moments of sorrow. And the interview with Joe Queenan, that I think he's the first talking head in the film, was really stunning. I was curious, how did you go about choosing your interview subjects?
Well, first I'd say there were two things. We had just finished the film Personality Crisis, and Jack Douglas had mixed the music, and I was in Savannah with him at the Savannah Film Festival. We're sitting on it's like Forrest Gump or something. We're sitting on this park bench, and he starts telling me this story that takes like 3 hours. And this is the abbreviated version of the story. And I had no idea we were going to be working on this. I was just fascinated that, you know, he's 17 years old. He hears it on the radio. He wants to be an actor. And he's like, no, I want to be a musician. And I'm going to go to Liverpool because I want to know, you know, where that music came from. I also had a friend whose father died when he was 14. And he essentially locked himself in his bed, filled with rage, and just smoked pot all day and listened to the Beatles. When he walked out when he was 18, he was still angry, but he was very functional. And so that was in the back of my mind. And we looked for people who could articulate, who had experienced in a, you know, the Beatles really changed their life in a significant way and could articulate the experience, what it meant to them. Of course, no one can really articulate it. I mean, Jamie, I think you did a great job. Like Vicky Bernacosta, I thought that was very beautiful. She says, it was my spirit, and then their spirit, and it comes together when you listen to the music. I thought, you know, I thought that was very beautiful. And through, you know, Kenneth's podcast and essays people had written and people we knew making recommendations, we eventually, you know, but it's hard because you don't want to talk to people too much beforehand and ruin the surprise. Like, there's something about the surprise coming out on camera that makes it more powerful. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Absolutely, no. I mean, really one of the other biggest surprises of the Maysles footage to me was I feel like we have this image of the Beatles in 1964, probably from A Hard Day's Night, of them being cheeky and kind of above it all and sort of removed. And in this footage, the thing that really stuck with me was just how in awe they seemed, and just totally overwhelmed in the best way. And I mean, the moment that really stuck with me, I know it's a small moment, was when Ringo is getting interviewed, I think by Murray the K, and he identifies himself as Ringo from the Beatles. And I just thought, he would never again need to say Ringo from the Beatles. They're so newly famous.
Yeah.
That's just so interesting to me, that very narrow period.
The moment that gets me in that vein is in the car ride to Sullivan, because they don't expect to be mobbed by, there were literally thousands of fans running in the street along with their car, and I mean, they don't think they're going to be able to get out of the car. And it surprises them. You know, they really is not what they expected in New York.
But they're so casual. I mean, Paul just so casually looks at them, hi, girls, as if the limo's not in danger of being crushed.
Yeah.
And it's really, there's no terror at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, speaking of Ed Sullivan, Debbie, you have a very interesting Ed Sullivan story.
Well, I was one of the 728 lucky people in the audience on February 9th, 1964. And it was that album I referenced earlier that actually helped get me there, because I loved the Beatles and I couldn't find anyone to love them as much as I did. So I wrote their fan club in England and said, please let me join. And when Brian Epstein was planning his trip in November, I received a telegram inviting me from his New York lawyer to come to his New York office on West 55th Street. The man's name was Walter Hoffer. And I showed up, and they were shocked because I was 13 years old. And they thought that they were going to have someone to run the fan club and do that kind of stuff. But it really was a very wonderful meeting that lasted all of 20 minutes. But as I left, and I got to meet Brian Epstein, which, you know, I still think is just one of the most fortunate things ever. And he was a lovely, lovely, lovely man. And the secretary to Walter Hoffer called me over to her desk and said, I want to be sure that we have your address. I lived in New Jersey, that we have your address and your phone number correct, because we think we are going to need you in the future. And sure enough, they did, but they sent me a single ticket to go to the Ed Sullivan Show.
Wow.
So that's how I got there that night. And it was quite a an experience. My mom came with me, and we fought the crowds. We drove across the George Washington Bridge, down the West Side Highway, and we parked on 51st Street, and we walked to the theater, and we got stopped by this humongous thing of a police officer on a horse. My mom, 5'1", was looking up at the officer saying, "We're on our way to the theater," and he didn't even believe my mom, but I managed to get in, and I have to tell you, what an experience. It was just, I was here, and the Beatles were like there. And it was, yes, we did scream. I do remember there was a monitor, TV monitor on the right, and they were showing commercials early on, right, of the show in between. And there was an Aniston commercial, and I remember thinking with all this screaming, honestly, I thought, boy, are these camera people going to need an Aniston. I so remember that thought. But when Paul started to sing All My Loving, it was just like an amazing, amazing experience. And I still think about it frequently. Actually, I talk about it a lot too. And it always stops, conversation when people say, "Oh, you were there at the Ed Sullivan Show." But and the funny thing is you take it 60 years later. In 2018, I'm actually a consultant to the man who currently bought the Sullivan Show from the Precht family, Sullivan Productions. And I go to work every day at my monitor, and I look at the Beatles on my desktop at home. And I think to myself, wow, if I only knew sitting in that seat where I was like crying and so overwhelmed that 60 years later, I'd be actually like working on the show. But, being at the Sullivan Theater that night was very special, and I have utmost respect for Ed Sullivan. He knew, contrary to the famous story about him just seeing the screaming at London Airport, that was not true. Ed had talent agents in the UK, a man by the name of Peter Pritchard, who kept telling Ed about the Beatles, and Ed, you should book them, and you should book them. And then that summer of '63, Ed did send his talent person, Jack Babb, to the UK, and Jack saw the Beatles perform twice. So when Ed did see those screamers that we see in the film, and being just so, loving the Beatles, Ed was already clued into them. And when he got back, he said, yeah, let's book these guys. So there's a lot of, urban legends about Ed just saw screaming girls. Who are they? No, Ed knew. And the funny thing is one day I was talking to someone about it, like online, and he said, no. He said, well, I'm going to go onto edsullivan.com and read the real story. I said, go ahead, because I wrote it. So,
Great.
Jamie, you also have a Ed Sullivan in '65 story, if I recall.
Yeah. Well, it was my really good fortune, 1,000 times over, that my dad was so into the Beatles. And he and I were also really into John Lennon's poetry. In His Own Right, W-R-I-T, you remember that book? Mm-hmm. And we loved it. We memorized it. We made jokes about it. We would sing rounds. We would create a round out of the song, the poem, The Moldy Man. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so my dad was actually thinking about setting those poems to music. And I wish he had done that, but he never got around to it. However, it did give him an entree, and he got into contact with the press agent for the Beatles, whose name comes up in the film, I think, Wendy Hansen. That name came up I heard that name in the film.
Wendy was Brian's personal executive assistant.
Well, there you go.
That's it.
So Wendy Hansen arranged for my dad to meet the Beatles at the dress rehearsal for this second appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. We're now a year later, in the summer of 1965. And so my dad, bless his heart, said, "Is it okay if I bring my kids?" and she said yes. So we jumped in the car and we drove in from our house in Connecticut. And you can just imagine, I'm now 12 years old, and I have braces, and I really want to look cute for the Beatles. And it was so hopeless. It was so hopeless, and yet it was so exciting. And we were taken backstage at this dress rehearsal, where we watched Alan and Rossi rehearsing their appearance, and Rossi is wearing the Beatles wig and just being a total jerk, I thought. And we were taken backstage to meet them in their dressing room. And I've written about this in my book, Famous Father Girl. And I have a whole chapter called The Beatles Portal, in which I describe this incredible event. So I won't go into it too much. You can read about it in my book if you want. But I was in a coma of awe. And the one detail I'll share with you is that Ringo was not in the room with the other three. Why? Because they had been eating hamburgers with onions on them. And every Beatlemaniac worth her salt knew that the two things Ringo hated most were onions and Donald Duck. We all knew that. So, of course, he had excused himself and gone to a different dressing room to take a little nap and wait for the smell to go away. So it all came true, you know, it was all real. Mm-hmm. But my dad never set those poems to music, alas.
We were talking earlier. It sounds like you created some art based on your feelings for the Beatles.
Oh, I did. You know, when you're 11, you're still a kid, and you know, you're just totally open, and you have no self-consciousness. So I wrote poems, and I wrote lyrics to their songs expressing my love for them, and I drew pictures, and I made this really pretty cool collage, which I still have on my wall at home, where I cut out words from my fan magazines and made this sort of wonderful, you know, with photographs and pictures and razzles and dazzles. And then at the very bottom right-hand corner of the collage is this little picture of Elvis Presley going like this. And I made this little bubble where I'm showing him saying, "Hey, wait for me!"
That's amazing. Love to see that.
Yeah.
Throughout this documentary, you hear so much about what the Beatles meant to America, but there's that great clip of the reporter, I think it's at JFK, asking the Beatles, you know, what's your ambition? And George says, to come to America. Mm-hmm. Ken, I wanted to ask, what did America mean to the Beatles?
Well, in their case, you know, it was an opportunity and a challenge. All of the previous British acts had failed, went back decades of failure. So it was an opportunity to turn the tide, to stem the tide. And of course, as I said before, they did it so magnificently well. And they win us over, you know, as eloquently noted by my colleagues, through looks and charm and charisma, and of course their music. But it's that evolution that matters, right? By 1965, well, in 64, it's the teeny boppers or the pre-teeny boppers, right, who love the Beatles, or the 8-year-olds. By the time we get to 1965, we have Yesterday, which brings in a whole new group of folks. Suddenly, it's okay to like the Beatles if you're in your 30s, right? You get, at the end of the year, the biggest song of the year is not even a single. It's on Rubber Soul, and it's Michelle. Huh. It's killing it on the airwaves. That brings in many, many more. We get 1966, and we have a single that has what? Eleanor Rigby on one side, so grandma's happy, and Yellow Submarine on the other. So it's 8 to 88 quite suddenly. 1967 shows up, Strawberry Fields Forever, Sgt. Pepper, etc. It is the greatest demographic expansion in history. And it's their ambition that I think we see hidden just below the veil in this wonderful documentary. It's that ambition. They're here for a purpose, and they deliver on it.
I was lucky enough to be at the premiere screening a week or so back, and I couldn't help but look a little over to my right and watch Sir Paul's face as he was watching himself on the screen, and I trying to imagine what was going through his mind. 'Cause in a way, these were his vacation movies, in a funny way.
Right.
I was wondering, did Paul or Ringo speak to you at all about, this film on an emotional level, what it meant to them?
I wouldn't say on an emotional level. They saw it as a film.
Yeah.
They saw early cuts. They made comments about it very respectfully. They were respectful of the process. But I would say that Paul, when we did the interview, because he was already thinking about 1964. He had done this wonderful exhibit, first in London and then at the Brooklyn Museum, Eye of the Storm, about all of his photographs from '64. So he was really, he was really in it. It was very emotional for him sometimes. He would see things that he remembered. He has an amazing memory. He would remember often when he took the photo. So in that sense, and we only used maybe 10 minutes of the interview, but I think he did, he had some interesting insights. And Ringo too, having, his clothes, having his drum kit brought certain physical memories, So in that, I'd say that was emotional for both of them. In a way, I mean, for me, the most unbelievable moment in the film is when you see the piece of wood on the roster, and oh yeah, well I only fell off the roster once. It's they were extraordinary.
I think I have time for one more question. I want to put it to anyone who was conscious in 1964. There's a great moment, one of my favorite moments of the documentary actually, when the reporter's asking Paul, what do you think the Beatles' effect on Western culture will be? And he laughs in the guy's face. Western culture, it's just a laugh. If that reporter were to ask any one of you that question in 1964, how would you have answered it, you think?
Well, I would have said that it put the spotlight on young people and made them just as important as the grown-ups. And that was the key to the whole shift that followed, I think.
I agree, because it was the first time, like as I mentioned, that meeting I had with Brian and the group. It was like suddenly, I think, teenagers, we were at the heart of what was happening. And we were able to, as we grew older, the Beatles grew older and they changed with us and we all evolved together. And I think that's what it was. I remember standing up in my seat at the Sullivan Theater after seeing them, and I thought to myself, yeah, the show, I start to cry when I think about it sometimes, but yes, the show might be over. But you know what? For me, and I know for the other people here, it is just beginning. It was so, so special. I left the theater in absolute tears, and I spotted my mother diagonally across the street in her navy blue cloth coat, waiting for me in the cold. And you know what? And as Ken said, it's like, they evolved with us. And America was ready, and the world was ready. And, when you imagine, Jamie, that they looked like Buddy Holly, that's amazing, because really it was Buddy Holly they took so much from Buddy Holly and went so that if your imagination was there. And that's what they provided for so many of us, imagination where we could grow, and we grew with their lyrics. I mean, when you think about it, from I Want to Hold Your Hand to why don't we do it in the road? I mean, come on, right? You know, it's like that was the Beatles.
Right.
That was the Beatles. So, you know, I just think it was, you know, what can I
Great
say?
note to end on.
Right.